Shalom, and welcome to this edition of Contextual Bible Study. My name is Denny Thompson, and today we're doing part 2 of the Dead Sea Scrolls story. The story of the people who went down to live in a place called Qumran by the Dead Sea, who typically are called the Essenes, but they call themselves the Yaqid, which means the community. Now remember why they went down there in our part 1. This is very important. They wanted to fulfill this prophecy. In the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. So this idea of make straight was the idea of pathways, have straight pathways. Remember the shepherd's path, a path of righteousness. And it was interpreted as living holy lives, to live according to what God said, real specifically, real exactly. And then if they did that, the glory of the Lord will be revealed, or in other words, the Messiah will come. So that's why they went there, this group of people. Well, as we learned last time, there were a few that didn't go to Qumran. There were a few that went to other parts of Israel, and some of them even married, had families, but this particular group did not marry. Now, a very, very central activity in their daily life were communal meals. They all ate together. And in this diagram of this very small settlement called Qumran, that circle right there is the area where they ate. We can tell from evidence, archaeologists can over time, that that was the communal eating hall. And we know actually what they ate because some of that can be determined by lots of things in archaeology, but they ate bread, olives, cheese, salted fish, and certainly only kosher meat, and only on occasion, mostly for meals that were celebrating religious holidays. They ate dates and honey because there are date palms right nearby. And they grow in this area, and they still do to this very day. And they drank water, goat milk, and something called tarash, which is diluted wine. And that was very, very popular in the ancient world because it would kind of purify water that might not be pure. In fact, most of the water was not pure, but this diluted wine would help. Now, also found here were some very expensive stone jars. Now, these were expensive to make and to have, and they are not found in very many places in Israel. So, what is the point of a stone jar? It was determined that stone jars did not become ritually impure like normal pottery or clay jars. If you remember the story of the wedding at Cana, Jesus' first miracle, remember the jars that from which he turned the water into wine? Those big jars were used for ritual purification water. Okay, so that was central here. Anyway, this is important because this is so central to their living in this area. They wanted to live these pure lives, this straight path. Now, they ate a sacred meal in anticipation of a victory banquet of the coming Messiah. Now, remember, the whole idea of the Messiah is so important, and they believed in, interesting enough, 2 different comings of the Messiah. One of them like Aaron, a priest, and the other like David, a king, a conquering king, which is interesting. So they ate a sacred meal, very important, in anticipation of a victory banquet of the coming Messiah. This was central to their activities. This very, very important sacred meal, this victory banquet. There is an interesting tradition that the bones of the meat, which were probably eaten at that meal, because it's unlikely they had meat very often, if not at all, except for those sacred meals, possibly. So the tradition of what they did with the bones is a little bit confusing, but I think we maybe have an idea. They would put them in jars and they would bury them outside of the city. Okay, and now it looks like it's interesting that there's a connection to the temple, but Josephus records that the vessels were very often intact and usable, and a limited number of such jars implies they came from special occasions or sacred feasts. The bones are treated like temple sacrifices. I want to look at what that means. So in other words, there weren't very many of these found. So it kind of supports the idea that this is only these sacred banquets. So why did they take the bones? Why did they bury them outside the city in these jars? Well, we don't know for sure because it's not really recorded, but it's possibly this. The idea from the Jerusalem temple, because remember, the Jerusalem temple was very corrupt, and they were trying to purify all of that corruption that's going on up there and live these holy lives that those priests were not living. But one of the things that had happened in the temple over the many years it was in existence, and it wasn't always corrupt, obviously, but the bones from special animal sacrifices were collected in various methods. They were put in different containers, and this picture, this diagram kind of shows you some of them. And then they were buried outside of the camp or outside of the city. It goes back to the laws of the Torah, where the bones were taken outside the camp to a clean place as part of the maintaining the ritual purity of the area. Okay, so it could have been connected to that. We don't really know. It's just interesting that they found these bones. Now, the most important activity they did was what? Well, it was in the scriptorium. Most important as far as really what they were doing, but also as far as how we are concerned with this whole incident and why this is so incredibly important. So what was the scriptorium? It was a place that they actually wrote the scrolls. Now this is from the actual place, a picture I took. It's a little bit grainy. It kind of diagrams what it might have looked like. They're trying to kind of recreate what did this scriptorium look like. But we do know that everything was done with extreme care, extreme care. There were people watching over the shoulders of everyone writing. In fact, there's different accounts as to how every single scroll was written, and they vary a little bit, but we do know that they were done very precisely, and they were very often ritually purified themselves, even as they were writing the scrolls, to make sure, because they're dealing with God's word here. Now, according to their manual discipline, that was one of the very important other scrolls found, which tells us all about the life in this community. The teachings of the Torah are to be continually studied day and night. Now, no single person could do this without resting, so the community divided itself into 3 shifts, one of which was always reading, studying, and worshiping. So remember, they're trying to live out the scriptures, every detail of the scriptures. In this way, they were able to fulfill the teaching in Psalms 1 and 2. Blessed is a man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates, okay, coming up here, day and night. Not just day, but day and night. So they wanted to divide their community up in a way that they could do exactly what it said. And they found all kinds of these little tiny olive lights, little lanterns. Now, the kind of light that they had to work by was really incredibly small, so it's amazing. Obviously, the kind of lights we had. But these little olive lamps, and this is actually from Qumran too, this picture I took. It says, and the congregation shall watch in community for a third of every night of the year to read the book and to study law and to bless together. This is from the community rule. So this is their own very important interpretations of what the scriptures said. And these are probably, very likely, because they're found right in the area, the lights that they use to do this during the nighttime. This is actually a copper inkwell that was found from Qumran. And they found several of these, but here's one of them. Okay. And these are some of the ink making materials that they use, or use various things to create the ink and to create the little instrument that they wrote with, which is actually likely bamboo. You can see the scribe with his hand to the right there holding this. They would sharpen a point, dip it in the inkwell, and then write very precisely. Now, the custom of the day was not to sit at a table like we would picture and write. It's amazing how they did this to me, but they squatted and they wrote on their lap. So tables and chairs were not really used for many years until maybe even the Middle Ages, but they actually squatted. So something like this. Okay, that's incredible how they did this, but that's how they would have written these scrolls. Precisely. It doesn't show in this picture, but you would have somebody looking over the shoulder at all times. Now, most were written on animal skins, okay, called parchment. And these animals had to be kosher or pure animals, such as the ibex, which is in this area. The Bible refers to this as a deer at times, but it's this animal right here. They're also found in Africa. They were considered kosher, and that was probably the most common hide that was used to make these skins, is parchment skins. They were sewn together with tendons and dried veins. Just think how complicated this would be to create this. A little bit different than going to the store and buying some paper. All right, now this right here is a pottery kiln from Qumran. Why am I showing you this? Because it's very important, because they made all kinds of these jars, which eventually they're going to put the scrolls into. So the kiln kind of indicates that's probably the area where they made these. And there was a lot of them that they did make, because there are many, many of them found in caves. Now, a few of the scrolls, very few, were found complete. Vast majority were in pieces. And I showed you a picture last time of maybe what it would have looked like trying to put this together. So what a complicated process of trying to literally piece this together. We talk about a complicated puzzle. Now, the Essenes and some other biblical events. I want to kind of connect some things here. So bear with me. Let's look into this. All right. First of all, right beneath this hill right here is Qumran, this mountain. You can see the Dead Sea. Now, just north of the Dead Sea, just north of it, by the Jordan River, is a place called Bethany by the Jordan. Now, that should ring a bell with you. You might wonder, why am I showing you this? Well, that's exactly where John the Baptist was baptizing, right there, where Jesus would have come to meet John the Baptist and be baptized. So the question is, did John ever have contact with Qumran? Or that's kind of a thought, I guess I would say. Is it possible? Did he go to Qumran? There's some common language between what John said and the people of Qumran. So do we know the answer? Really, no. Was it all the same? No. But there was some commonality. Now, John, like the Essenes, went down here, not in Jerusalem, remember, because there was so much corruption, just like the Essenes did, or the Yaqid, they called themselves. And John said this, a voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, he's living out the prophecy too. Exactly. This is from Luke, but he's quoting Isaiah. So was John an Essene? I think it's unlikely he was an Essene, for a few reasons. Did he ever visit there? Probably did, but we don't know for sure. I'm only guessing. He said, the man with two tunics should share with him who has none. And the one who has food should do the same. Okay, that sounds like the Essenes. Remember, they shared everything in common. The traditional Jewish belief was that the ritual baths wash ritual uncleanness from the body. But the Essenes had kind of a little new twist on all this, and they kind of interpreted the idea of repentance along with the idea of ritually being clean, which is interesting. How do we know that? Because here's something from their community rule, something they actually wrote that they went by. No one may enter the water, that means this ritually pure water in this mikvah, unless he had repented of his evil, because his uncleanness clings to all transgressions of his word. Interesting. Okay, now that's a little different than normal ritual uncleanliness, where they were just trying, remember we talked about that last time, that maybe they had touched something impure or whatever. This is incorporating the idea of repentance along with it. So that's interesting. But there's a lot of differences too between John the Baptist's message and the message of the Essenes of Yaqid. The whole Judean countryside and all the people of Jerusalem went out to him. John invited everybody. The Essenes, not even close. They were very exclusionary, extremely so. To be a member of that, you had to go through all kinds of things we talked about last time. So that's very, very, very different. And this message would be the message that Jesus would carry out, obviously, too. So did Messiah Jesus show up in the wilderness in fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy that both John and the Essenes talked about and wanted to live out? Well, I think you know the answer to that. Yes. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Okay, now this is not just a story about the temptations that are going to happen here. It's a story about prophecy fulfillment, which is so very, very central. Jesus was doing all the time, referring back to the scriptures, how he was fulfilling prophecy. So there you go, right here. He did. He did exactly this. He did what the Essenes were looking for and what John was looking for. Because in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths in the desert, a highway for our God. Remember that? The straight paths and the glory of the Lord will be revealed. And that's what he did in fulfillment of this very, very important prophecy. Now, ways the Essenes' terminology was similar to Paul's writing. Okay, so let's look at that. Now, they did not marry. Okay, remember we learned last time there were only 3 female skeletons that were found in the area, so they didn't marry. The people who lived down here, they were celibate. Remember Paul said this, it is better not to marry. The end of the age is at hand was an expression of the Essenes. That's an expression of Paul. The righteous shall live by faith was directly from the Essenes, and that's an expression that Paul used. So that's kind of interesting. Now the New Testament term works of the law was an Essene term. Now we see that from time to time. That came from the Essenes actually. It did not refer to the earning salvation by works. Rather, it distinguished them as God's covenant people, and the Gentiles were excluded. Now that's important because that can be really misunderstood, and it sounds like that terminology came right from them. This whole idea, them being distinguished as his covenant people, Gentiles excluded. Okay, again, that's different than Jesus' teachings and what Paul said too. Now, other ways the Essenes referred to themselves. Okay, they called themselves righteous and devout. Now, we know this from their writings. They said waiting for the consolation of Israel was an expression that they used, a phrase. They wrote looking forward to the redemption of Israel. Okay, now let's look at those expressions right now and draw some conclusions. Now, were Anna and Simeon and others influenced by the Essenes? Okay, so let's go to this right here. When Anna and Simeon first saw baby Jesus. Remember that story? All right, Simeon said this. Now there was a man in Jerusalem called Simeon, or this is written about Simeon, I should say. Now there was a man in Jerusalem called Simeon who was righteous and devout. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel. Righteous and devout is an expression right from the Essenes, which would have predated this. Okay? Anna, she gave thanks to God and spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. Looking forward to the redemption of Israel was the exact expression from the Essenes. Consolation of Israel, redemption of Israel. This will be a Messiah who would bring freedom. Okay, and it's interesting, these connections here. Now, on the road to Emmaus, remember the 2 people who did not understand who Jesus was, that he was walking in their midst. We were going to learn that, but not at first. We had hoped he was the one who was going to redeem Israel, was the expression. And remember, the expression of the Essenes, looking forward to the redemption of Israel. The Essenes words, there were some that were also similar to Jesus' teachings. Now, were later Essenes in Jesus' audience. So remember, the Essenes, the original group started earlier than when Jesus would have been teaching, but they would have been still around. There were groups that are still around. And remember, not all of them went to Qumran. Some of them scattered in other places. Okay, so they used the term mammon, and so did Jesus. They call themselves the meek, the poor in spirit. And remember, Jesus used those expressions in the Sermon on the Mount. They use the phrase, blessed are thou, and today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. These are all their expressions. Now, it's interesting. It could be a coincidence, or it could be that maybe Jesus was connecting to an Essene audience that was right in front of him as he was teaching. I personally think that's what was going on. He was using expressions that would be familiar to them. Okay, so it's just kind of speculation, but it's interesting. And turn the other cheek. Remember that expression Jesus said? The Essenes' understanding was this: if you are obeying God and someone comes and hits you in the face because of your obedience, you need to say, I am sorry I offended you, but I must obey God. And that even if they hit you again. So that's right directly from them. In the Essene hymn book, okay, it says this in one of the hymn books. It says, to proclaim to the meek the multitude of thine mercies, and to let them that are of contrite spirit to be nourished from the source of knowledge, and to them that mourn everlasting joy. There's so many of these expressions that sound so familiar, and yet obviously there were differences because the Essenes did not believe in helping those outside the community, as we've mentioned here. Okay. Now remember, Jesus said this, you have heard it said, that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now there's been some wondering and so forth, where did that come from? Who said hate your enemy? Was that the Pharisees? Not evidence of that. There is none. It very likely was from the Essenes, because that would be an expression that came directly from them, the sons of light and sons of darkness. So they had this exclusionary ideas that really the Pharisees did not even have, nor obviously Jesus or John the Baptist. Now, at the entrance to Qumran, it says this, and to love the sons of light and to hate the sons of darkness. There you go. That sounds exactly like what Jesus was quoting. Probably was talking about these people. And Jesus said, you have heard it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Okay, so that again, that's where that expression probably came from. And likely, I believe he was referring to the Essenes, but again, it's a bit speculation here. So this was the idea that the Essenes had that was very important. They believe everything God did was predetermined. There is no free will, none whatsoever. And that very much is contrary to the Gospels and Jesus' teachings. But that's what they believe. This whole idea of sons of light and sons of darkness, everything is just written in God's plan, and there's no deviation. Really, in a sense, almost like no free will. So what happened to the Essenes? What happened to them? Okay, this is a fascinating story, and I think very important. Well, they believe there would someday be a battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. And that was going to be very, very important. Everything is going to be leading up to that time period. All right, jumping ahead in time. Now we're going ahead in time to a much later period, because the Essenes initially were probably in the almost 200 BC area, in the late 100s BC. So we're moving ahead to AD, probably about 66 AD. Vespasian, a very brutal Roman general who later became emperor, led his 10th legion through the valley. Okay, what valley? The Dead Sea Valley. He's coming down. There have been other parts of Israel, but we're talking specifically about that right now. Now remember, we finished the last one with this idea of the watchtower, the first teaching about the Essenes, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and how it's kind of oriented to the north. Well, that's where Vespasian came from. So they would have seen him. They certainly would have seen him coming. And that's important based on what they're going to do. All right. And they knew there was a dark day coming, but it was not going to turn out the way they thought it was going to. So what the Essenes did when they saw Vespasian's army coming, almost for certain, is this. Well, we know they did this. And I would easily speculate they did it when they saw the army coming. They might have put some in the caves before, but certainly when Vespasian's army was coming, they hurried these scrolls into the caves to protect them because they were so important. They had copied all these copies of God's word, and they want to protect them. Now we're going to kind of move this little video from Bible stock ahead and just kind of put yourselves in the place of the Essenes as they're running towards these caves, and here comes Vespasian and his troops. All right. And they got to hurry because they're coming. You can begin to see some of the caves are all over the place, holding these scrolls in hand and running. And here they go up into this whole area. Now, this is going to be so incredibly important, as I want to talk specifically at the conclusion of this, which we'll get to in a minute. But I just want you to kind of visualize this. Running, maybe tripping and falling at times over these rocks. We got to save these caves, or we got to save these scrolls. We got to get them in the caves. And that's what they did. All right. Now, in 68 AD, I think I said 66 a minute ago, but it's likely 68 would be a better, more accurate time period, was when this actually happened. There are very few details, in fact, really almost none, but we know the Romans just destroyed Qumran, just destroyed it. Now, did they kill every last person? No. No. It's very likely, though, that most of them were killed, almost for sure that most were killed, but some did escape. We know some of them went to Masada, and we're going to be doing a presentation on. I'm going to be doing a presentation on Masada soon. How do we know that? Because there were scrolls found on Masada that were Dead Sea Scrolls. So obviously somebody brought them up there, and they escaped probably other places too. A few of them might have even eventually joined the group that become the Nazarenes. We don't really know. I personally think they did, based on the way Jesus taught and how it seemed like he was connecting the Essene audience into his audience of the Nazarenes. But again, that's speculation. I just think it's interesting, and I think it's very possible. And I think a lot of them would have had the right kind of heart. Now, we know from evidence that others went down, as I mentioned, all the way down here. Now, there is Masada. You can see En-Gedi is in the pathway there. We'll be talking about that place too. But Masada. And they brought their scrolls with them. Masada is this amazing cliff in the desert. It's really, really something. Tremendous history there. It's one of the most important sites in Israel. Now, what happened to the scrolls? Well, after the Romans destroyed Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls sat silent for almost 1,900 years. There was really, we didn't know anything about it. Nothing until, something happened. The scrolls were so very important, they took the time to hide them. As you know, the Romans didn't find them at all. They sat there in silence. They were hidden. In fact, all the way till 1947 when this happened. I went over this in the first presentation. This Bedouin shepherd, Muhammad el-Dib, was trying to get one of his goats from the cave. He threw a stone ahead of him and hit a jar. And that's where it all started. That's when the first ones were discovered. The very first one was discovered. And then from then, all the rest of them. And they've been found in 11 caves so far. And they're very likely even more. There could be collapsed caves. Okay. Now, the most famous completely intact scroll they found was the Isaiah scroll. And that's significant because Isaiah is such an important prophet. Where is it today? All right. Well, it's in this building, this Shrine of the Book. Remember, the 7 original scrolls were put here in the Shrine of the Book. And this one, Isaiah scroll, is almost completely intact. Now, this actually is a copy of it right here, but it's an exact copy of the scroll that they have, which is located somewhere else. But it's right in the middle of Jerusalem. And I find that so fascinating because one chapter in Isaiah is Isaiah 53, which is really the biggest stumbling stone to the Jews accepting Jesus as Messiah. And that's the idea, that's that chapter about the suffering servant, okay, or the suffering Messiah. That's something they had so much trouble accepting. How could Messiah suffer? How could he be crucified and resurrected? Because they just, even though the scriptures certainly pointed this, Isaiah 53, their belief systems and their teachings kind of went away from it because they wanted the son of David to save him from the Romans, that whole story that we've talked about. But there it sits. And this literally is right there in the middle of that museum. And it just struck me as I was standing there looking at it several times, how amazing that is. But that's how God planned it. Now, why are the Dead Sea Scrolls so important? Why do we hear about them all the time? Now, I want to get very specific now. This is really important to understand, and I think this is very important in any of us defending our faith and defending the words of the Bible. So listen close. All right, they tell us a lot about an interesting people, very interesting people, and their way of life. We learned some about them. But the number one reason is this. Now, this is really important. The earliest scrolls dated to the 3rd century BC, which means the 200s BC. Okay? Previously, known manuscripts called the Masoretic text was written in 920 AD. Now, that would have been the oldest original manuscript we had, written in 920 AD. That would be the original earliest manuscript we had for all those years up until 1947. Okay, so and that hand copies over those years have been written over and over again, and the differences are incredibly significant. Most of them just kind of mostly grammar. Content-wise, no, really no changes at all. So why is this important? Think about it. Because people could say, well, yeah, the Masoretic text written so late, they could have changed it a lot to make the prophecies about Jesus kind of fit his life. No, you can't do that. Because these scrolls go back before his life, 3rd century BC. That's why they're so important. And it shows that the Bible has changed almost none over all those years, other than these minor little word changes or scribal errors, a few, or some grammar changes. Nothing in content at all, nothing significant whatsoever. So they proved the Bible is totally accurate. Now, there is nothing else. There's no other document, there's no other story proven even close the way the Bible is. Not even close. So anybody accepting stories about Alexander the Great or the Roman emperors, no. There's no original manuscripts like this. There just aren't. And God set this up, and it's these people who wrote these scrolls that are the ones that left this evidence. I just find it incredible. Now, there are more than 60 major prophecies about the coming Messiah. Now, the probability of just 8 of them coming true is 1 in 10 to the power of 17. All right, a little bit of math here. So the probability of all 60 major prophecies about Jesus, we're not even calculating that because it's too crazy of a big number. We're just taking 8. We're gonna take 8, and here's the probability: 1 in 10 to the power of 17. All right, remember I mentioned about these prophecies coming true about Jesus. People could say before the Masoretic text was written so much later. Well, they can't do that now, the Dead Sea Scrolls. So let's look at that. What does that even mean? Let's get a visual. Let's take the state of Texas. This came from Josh McDowell, by the way. I'm quoting him. He kind of calculated this. He said this: covered Texas 2 feet deep with silver dollars. Okay? That's a lot of silver dollars because Texas is a big state. So try to visualize that. It's crazy. Okay, then blindfold a person who must find one particular silver dollar with a special mark on it. You blindfold them and they can wander anywhere they want in Texas, reach down and grab it, pick it up. That's the probability of 8 prophecies coming true about Jesus. That's crazy. So in other words, no, it's amazing how this all worked out to prove Jesus was exactly who he said he was. So God had an incredibly great purpose for their work. All right. So that concludes our story of the Dead Sea Scrolls, part 2. And I want to thank you for watching both parts and to hopefully gain a better understanding of why this is so very, very important and how it's such a great affirmation of our faith. And again, thank you for watching. And my wish for you is complete shalom. Shalom.